Black Doctor's midnight walk saves a stranger's life. The night was pitch black, save for the harsh beam of Dr. James Carter's flashlight cutting through the darkness. Rain pounded mercilessly against his face as he knelt in the mud beside the unconscious man. Blood mixed with rainwater, creating crimson rivers that flowed across the pavement. "Stay with me," Dr. Carter urged, his fingers pressed against the stranger's neck, desperately searching for a pulse. The man's face was ashen, his breathing shallow and irregular. "I need you to stay with me." Dr. Carter's medical bag lay open beside him, its contents partially scattered across the wet ground. His hands moved with practiced precision despite the chaos around him. The wail of distant sirens pierced the night, but they were still too far away. "Come on," he whispered, administering emergency medication with steady hands. "Come on, fight." The stranger's eyelids fluttered briefly before closing again. Dr. Carter checked his watch. It had been nearly 4 minutes since he'd started CPR. The man's life was slipping away with each passing second. A car's headlights suddenly illuminated the scene, casting long shadows across the rain-soaked street. Dr. Carter didn't look up, his focus entirely on his patient. The car door slammed and footsteps splashed through puddles. "James," a woman's voice called out. "Oh my God, James." It was Alina, his wife, her face twisted with shock and fear as she took in the blood-covered scene before her. "Call the hospital," Dr. Carter instructed, his voice calm despite the storm raging around them. "Tell them I'm bringing in a critical patient with severe trauma and suspected internal bleeding. Tell them to prep OR3. Alina nodded and retreated to the car, her hands shaking as she dialed the number. Dr. Carter looked down at the stranger's face, a man he'd never met before tonight, a man whose life now depended entirely on him, miles from the hospital with only the contents of his medical bag between this stranger and death. "Don't you die on me," Dr. Carter whispered as the man's pulse grew weaker beneath his fingertips. "Not tonight, not like this. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when..." Dr. James Carter sat at his desk, rubbing his tired eyes as he reviewed his last patient file of the day. At 58, he was one of the most respected cardiologists at Mercy General Hospital, though the decades of service had begun to carve deep lines into his face. The wall clock showed 9:15 p.m., another late night at the hospital. A knock at his office door made him look up. Alina stood in the doorway, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in an elegant bun, a gentle smile on her face. After 35 years of marriage, she still looked at him the same way she had when they first met at Howard University in 1980. "I thought I'd find you here," she said, placing a brown paper bag on his desk. "You missed dinner again." James smiled apologetically. "Mrs. Winter's test results came back. I wanted to review them before tomorrow." Alina shook her head, though her expression remained fond. "The hospital won't fall apart if you come home at a reasonable hour, you know." I know," James replied, opening the bag to find a sandwich and a thermos of coffee. "You're too good to me." "Someone has to look after you," Alina said, perching on the edge of his desk. She glanced at the framed photo beside his computer, their 2 children, Michael and Sarah, both now grown with families of their own. Michael called. David made the baseball team. James' face lit up at the mention of his grandson. "That's fantastic. I promised I'd teach him my curveball this summer." "Just like you taught Michael," Alina nodded, her eyes growing serious. "James, you're working too much. Dr. Wilson said you picked up 3 extra shifts this month." James sighed, closing the patient file. "The younger doctors need guidance, and with Dr. Thompson retiring next month, you can't keep burning the candle at both ends," Alina interrupted gently. "You're not as young as you used to be." "Says who?" James challenged with a small smile, though he knew she was right. The long hours had been taking their toll, and the pain in his left knee, an old basketball injury from college, had been flaring up more frequently. Alina was about to respond when James' pager beeped. He checked it, frowning. "Emergency?" Alina asked. "No, just a reminder about tomorrow's board meeting," James replied, slipping the pager back into his pocket. "I promise I'll be home in an hour." Alina nodded, unconvinced. "I'll hold you to that. Don't forget, we're having brunch with Sarah and the kids on Sunday." After she left, James returned to his work but found his mind wandering. Alina was right. He had been pushing himself too hard lately. Perhaps it was time to start considering cutting back his hours, spending more time with his grandchildren while they were still young enough to want his company. His thoughts were interrupted by another knock. This time it was Dr. Melissa Chen, one of the promising young residents he'd been mentoring. "Dr. Carter, sorry to bother you so late," she said, hovering in the doorway. "Not at all, Melissa. Come in." James gestured to the chair across from his desk. Melissa sat down, fidgeting slightly with the sleeve of her white coat. At 32, she was brilliant but still sometimes lacked confidence in her abilities. "I wanted to ask your opinion on Mr. Ramirez's case." James nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead." His symptoms suggest mitral valve regurgitation, but his echocardiogram was inconclusive. "I'm wondering if we should order a transesophageal echo." "What's your hesitation?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. "Dr. Harrison thinks it's unnecessary. He wants to wait and see if the symptoms progress." James leaned back in his chair. Dr. Harrison was known for his conservative approach, sometimes to a fault. "And what do you think?" Melissa straightened her shoulders. "I think waiting could put Mr. Ramirez at risk for complications. He's already showing signs of heart failure. The tea would give us a clearer picture." James smiled, pride evident in his expression. "I agree, order the test. I'll speak with Dr. Harrison." Relief washed over Melissa's face. "Thank you, Dr. Carter. Trust your instincts, Melissa. They're good ones." As she turned to leave, James added, "And Melissa, go home, get some rest. The hospital will still be here tomorrow." "You should take your own advice, Dr. Carter," she replied with a knowing smile. After Melissa left, James finished his sandwich and packed up his things. The clock now read 10:30 p.m., later than he'd promised Alina, but still earlier than many of his recent nights. As he walked through the quiet hospital corridors toward the parking garage, James greeted the night staff by name. He'd worked at Mercy General for over 25 years, long enough to know the life story of nearly every long-time employee. "Heading home, Dr. Carter?" asked Jeff, the night security guard who'd been at Mercy since before James arrived. "Finally," James replied with a chuckle. "Alina's threatening to change the locks if I keep these hours." Jeff laughed. "Smart woman. My Diane did that once back in '95. Had to sleep in my car until she took pity on me." The two men shared a laugh before James continued to his car. The hospital parking garage was nearly empty at this hour, his footsteps echoing against the concrete. As he approached his car, James noticed something was off. His front tire was completely flat. Sighing, he set down his briefcase and medical bag. At his age, changing a tire wasn't his idea of a good time, especially after a 14-hour workday. He considered calling Alina, but she'd already made the trip to the hospital once tonight. Instead, he pulled out his phone to call a tow service, only to find the battery dead. He'd forgotten to charge it again. "Perfect," James muttered to himself. He could go back into the hospital to use a phone, but his house was only a mile and a half away. The night was clear, and despite the late hour, the walk would do him good. He could deal with the car tomorrow. Decision made, James grabbed his briefcase and medical bag. He never went anywhere without it, a habit formed during his early days as a doctor in the 1980s when he'd often been the only black physician for miles and had learned to be prepared for any situation. The streets were quiet as James began his walk home. It was nearly 11 p.m. now, and this part of town largely shut down after business hours. Streetlights cast pools of yellow light on the empty sidewalks, and the distant hum of the freeway was the only sound that broke the silence. James breathed deeply, enjoying the rare moment of solitude. His thoughts drifted to his conversation with Alina earlier. Perhaps it really was time to start scaling back. Dr. Chen and the other young doctors he'd mentored were more than capable, and the thought of spending more time with his grandchildren was certainly appealing. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed the sound, a faint groan coming from the alley up ahead. James paused, listening intently. There it was again, unmistakably human. Cautiously, James approached the alley entrance. "Hello, is someone there?" No response came, but he heard movement, shuffling, followed by another pained groan. Most people would have kept walking or perhaps called for help, but James was a doctor. Helping others wasn't just his profession, it was who he was. He turned on his phone's flashlight, despite the low battery, and ventured into the alley. The beam of light revealed a man slumped against the wall, clutching his chest. Even in the dim light, James could see the man's face was contorted in pain, his breathing labored. James rushed forward, medical instincts taking over. "I'm a doctor. Can you tell me what's wrong?" The man looked up, startled by James' sudden appearance. He was in his mid-60s, with weathered features and clothes that had seen better days. "My chest," he gasped. "Can't breathe right." James set down his bags and knelt beside the man, immediately checking his pulse. It was rapid and irregular. "How long have you been experiencing this pain?" "Started this afternoon," the man managed between labored breaths. "Thought it would pass." "What's your name?" James asked, opening his medical bag. Richard Daniels." "I'm Dr. Carter. James, I'm going to help you, Richard." But Richard's eyes had closed and he wasn't responding. James immediately began CPR, his medical training taking over completely. Between compressions, he looked around desperately for help, but the street remained empty. After several minutes of CPR, Richard showed signs of response, a faint groan, a fluttering of eyelids. James sat back on his heels, relief washing over him, but it was short-lived. Richard's condition was critical, and without immediate professional medical attention, his chances were slim. In that moment, as if answering an unspoken prayer, headlights appeared in the distance. James waved frantically, and to his immense relief, the car slowed. The driver rolled down his window, a young man with a concerned expression. "I need help," James called out. "This man is having a heart attack. Do you have a phone I can use to call an ambulance?" The young man, who introduced himself as Marcus, immediately got out of his car. "I'll do better than that. Let's get him to the hospital now." Together, they carefully moved Richard to Marcus' car, laying him across the back seat. James climbed in beside him to continue monitoring his condition while Marcus drove. "Mercy General is the closest," James directed. "It's where I work." Marcus nodded, accelerating as much as was safely possible. "My dad had a heart attack last year," he explained, glancing in the rearview mirror. "I know every second counts." In the back seat, James continued to care for Richard, whose condition remained precarious. "Hang in there, Richard," he murmured. "We're almost there." When they arrived at the emergency entrance of Mercy General, James was relieved to see Dr. Chen still on duty. She rushed out with a team and a gurney as soon as Marcus pulled up. "Dr. Carter?" she exclaimed, surprised to see her mentor in the back of a stranger's car with a patient. "Suspected myocardial infarction," James reported professionally, helping the team transfer Richard to the gurney. "Started approximately 6 hours ago. Patient lost consciousness about 20 minutes ago. I've administered aspirin and performed CPR." Dr. Chen nodded, immediately directing her team to take Richard inside. James followed, leaving Marcus with a hurried but heartfelt thank you. Inside, the emergency room sprang into action. James stepped back, allowing his colleagues to do their jobs, but he remained close by, unwilling to leave Richard's side until he knew the man would be okay. Alina arrived shortly after, having been called by the hospital staff. She found James in the waiting area, still in his work clothes from earlier, looking exhausted but alert. "James," she said, sitting beside him and taking his hand. "The nurses told me what happened. Are you all right?" James nodded, his eyes fixed on the doors leading to the treatment area. "I'm fine, just worried about Richard." "Richard? The man I found. He was alone, Alina, having a heart attack in an alley, alone, afraid to go to the hospital because he couldn't afford it." James shook his head, a mixture of sadness and frustration evident in his expression. "No one should have to make that choice." Alina squeezed his hand. "You were there for him when he needed someone. That's what matters now." They sat together in silence for a while until Dr. Chen emerged through the doors. Her expression was serious but not grim, a look James knew well. "He's stabilized," she reported. "We're taking him up to the cardiac unit for further treatment and observation. It was close, Dr. Carter, if you hadn't found him when you did." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what could have happened. "Thank you, Melissa," James said. "Has he regained consciousness?" "Briefly." "He was asking for you, actually. Called you his midnight angel." Dr. Chen smiled. "You can see him tomorrow after he's rested." James nodded, finally allowing himself to feel the exhaustion of the night's events. Alina stood up, gently tugging on his hand. "Come on, James, let's get you home. You've done all you can for tonight." As they walked toward the exit, James paused, looking back at the treatment area doors. "I want to follow up on him personally, Alina. Make sure he gets the care he needs, regardless of his financial situation." Alina nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Of course you do, and that's one of the many reasons I love you." The next morning, despite Alina's protest that he should rest, James returned to the hospital. He found Richard in the cardiac unit, looking considerably better than he had the night before, though still weak. "Dr. Carter," Richard greeted him, his voice stronger now. "They told me you brought me in last night. That you found me in that alley and saved my life." James pulled up a chair beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," Richard admitted with a weak smile. "But I'm alive thanks to you." "The hospital staff did the hard part," James demurred. Richard shook his head. "No, Doc, you were the one who stopped, who cared enough to help a stranger in an alley." His eyes grew moist. "Most people would have just kept walking." James considered this. "I don't believe that. I think most people want to help. Sometimes they just don't know how." They talked for a while longer, and James learned more about Richard's life. He had been a construction worker until a workplace injury 3 years ago left him unable to continue in his profession. Without health insurance and with limited options, he'd fallen on hard times. The chest pains had started days ago, but fear of medical bills had kept him from seeking help. I kept telling myself it was just indigestion, Richard admitted. Pretty stupid, huh? Not stupid, James replied. It's a calculation too many people have to make in our healthcare system. As James prepared to leave, Richard caught his hand. Doc, I don't know how I'm going to pay for all this. I don't have insurance and my savings are— James cut him off gently. Let me worry about that. For now, you focus on getting better. Outside Richard's room, James sought out the hospital's financial counselor. By the end of the day, he had arranged for Richard to be covered under the hospital's charity care program, ensuring he would receive the treatment he needed without financial ruin. But as James walked back to his office, he couldn't stop thinking about how many others like Richard were out there. People who delayed seeking medical care because of cost concerns until it was almost too late. It was a problem he'd witnessed throughout his career, one that seemed to have no easy solution. In his office, James found Melissa waiting for him. "How's your patient?" she asked. "Recovering," James replied, sitting down heavily in his chair. "But it was too close, Melissa, far too close." She nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. "The board meeting starts in 20 minutes. Do you want me to tell them you're not coming?" James had completely forgotten about the meeting. He was about to agree when an idea began to form in his mind. "No," he said slowly. "I'll be there. In fact, I think I have something important to discuss." The board meeting was already underway when James arrived. Dr. Harrison, the chief of medicine, was discussing budget allocations, but he paused when James entered the room. "Ah, Dr. Carter, we were beginning to think you wouldn't join us." "My apologies for the delay," James said, taking his seat at the long table. Around him sat the hospital's leadership, doctors, administrators, and community representatives who guided Mercy General's policies and future. As the meeting progressed, James listened intently, waiting for the right moment. Finally, when Dr. Harrison called for any other business, James raised his hand. "I'd like to propose a new initiative," he began, his voice firm and clear. All eyes turned to him. "Last night, I encountered a man having a heart attack in an alley not far from here. He had been experiencing symptoms for days, but avoided seeking medical attention because he feared the cost." The room fell silent as James recounted his experience with Richard, describing the man's condition and the narrow margin by which his life had been saved. "This isn't an isolated incident," James continued. "Every day, people in our community make the choice between their health and financial stability. I believe Mercy General can do more to address this issue." Dr. Harrison frowned. "You already have the charity care program, James, and our emergency department treats everyone, regardless of ability to pay." "Yes," James acknowledged. "But what about preventative care? What about follow-up treatment? What about the people who never make it to our doors because they're too afraid of the bills that will follow?" He outlined his proposal. A mobile clinic that would provide basic medical services in underserved neighborhoods, staffed by volunteer doctors and nurses from Mercy General. The clinic would offer preventative care, health education, and help connect patients with financial assistance programs for more complex medical needs. The cost would be minimal compared to emergency treatment, James argued, and the impact on community health could be substantial. The board members exchanged glances. James knew his proposal was unexpected and would face scrutiny, but he pressed on, drawing on decades of experience and respect he'd earned at the hospital. By the end of the meeting, while no final decision had been made, a committee had been formed to explore the feasibility of James' mobile clinic idea. It was a start, a small one perhaps, but a start nonetheless. As the weeks passed, James divided his time between his regular duties, visits to Richard, who was recovering well, and developing his mobile clinic proposal. The idea had taken hold of him, giving him a renewed sense of purpose. Eleanor noticed the change in him. "I haven't seen you this energized in years," she commented one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. "Not since you started the cardiac rehabilitation program back in the 90s. James smiled, taking her hand. "I feel like I'm finally addressing a problem I've seen throughout my entire career. Maybe I can make a real difference before I retire." "Before you retire?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "I thought you were planning to cut back your hours, not take on a whole new project." "It's different this time," James insisted. "This isn't just more work, it's work that matters in a new way. And yes, I still plan to cut back my regular hours. I want to spend more time with you and the grandkids, but this clinic, Eleanor, it could help so many people." Eleanor studied his face, then nodded slowly. "I know that. Look, there's no talking you out of this, is there?" "Not a chance," James grinned. "Then I suppose I'll have to help," she sighed dramatically, though her eyes twinkled. "Someone needs to keep you organized." Meanwhile, Richard's recovery continued to progress. During one of James' visits, he found Richard sitting up in bed, looking through a photo album with a young woman, his daughter, Lisa, as James soon learned. "Dr. Carter," Richard greeted him warmly. "I was just telling Lisa about my midnight angel." Lisa stood and embraced James, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for saving my father," she said. "I don't know what I would have done if I'd lost him." James returned the embrace, moved by her gratitude. "I'm just glad I was there." As they talked, James learned more about Richard's life. Before his injury, he had been active in his community, volunteering at a local shelter and mentoring young men. His injury had not only affected his physical health, but had isolated him from the community activities that had given his life meaning. "I miss it," Richard admitted. "Being useful, making a difference." An idea struck James. "Richard, I'm working on a project, a mobile clinic to provide health care in underserved neighborhoods. Once you're fully recovered, we could use someone with your community connections and experience." Richard's face lit up. "You serious, Doc? You'd want my help?" "Absolutely," James confirmed. "Your insights would be invaluable." For the first time since James had met him, Richard looked truly hopeful. "I'd like that, Doc. I'd like that a lot." Over the next 2 months, the mobile clinic project gained momentum. The hospital board, impressed by James' detailed proposal and the support it had garnered from staff and community members, approved a pilot program. A decommissioned ambulance was donated by the city and converted into a basic clinic space. Medical supplies were contributed by pharmaceutical companies and medical equipment suppliers that had relationships with the hospital. James worked tirelessly, coordinating volunteers, developing protocols, and identifying neighborhoods with the greatest need. To his surprise, many of his colleagues eagerly volunteered their time, including Melissa, who became his right hand in organizing the project. "You've inspired a lot of people, Dr. Carter," she told him one day as they inventoried supplies for the clinic's launch. "Everyone wants to be part of this." James smiled, though he deflected the praise. "He just needed an opportunity to help. Most doctors go into medicine because they want to make a difference." The day before the mobile clinic's inaugural run, James visited Richard, who had been discharged weeks earlier but continued to come to the hospital for cardiac rehabilitation. Richard had become an integral part of the mobile clinic planning, using his community connections to spread the word and identify locations where the clinic would be most effective. "All set for tomorrow, Doc?" Richard asked, his eyes bright with anticipation. "As ready as we'll ever be," James replied. "Are you sure you're up for it? It's going to be a long day." Richard waved away his concern. "Doc, you gave me back my life. The least I can do is help you give others the same chance." That night, James found it difficult to sleep, his mind racing with last-minute details and contingency plans. Alina found him in their kitchen at 3 a.m., reviewing the clinic's procedure manual for the 5th time. "James," she said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder, "it's going to be fine. Come back to bed." James looked up at her, suddenly overwhelmed by the support she had shown throughout this entire endeavor. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Alina." "I know," she replied with a teasing smile. "Now come to bed. Your midnight walks have already saved one life. You don't need to make it a habit." The next day dawned clear and bright. By 7 a.m., the mobile clinic, now emblazoned with the words "Mercy on the Move," and the hospital's logo, was fully stocked and ready to go. A team of volunteers, including doctors, nurses, a social worker, and Richard as community liaison, gathered in the hospital parking lot. James addressed the group briefly. "What we're doing today won't solve all the healthcare problems in our community," he acknowledged. "But for someone out there, it might make all the difference. Thank you all for being part of this." Their first stop was a community center in one of the city's most underserved neighborhoods. James had expected a modest turnout for their first day, perhaps a dozen patients at most. He was stunned when they arrived to find a line stretching around the block. "Word travels fast," Richard commented with a satisfied smile. The day was a blur of activity. James and the medical team provided basic checkups, blood pressure screenings, diabetes testing, and health education. The social worker helped patients navigate insurance applications and financial assistance programs. Richard moved through the crowd, a friendly face who could relate to the community's concerns and explain the clinic's services. By the end of the day, they had seen over 60 patients, identified several serious health conditions that required follow-up care, and scheduled appointments at Mercy General for those who needed more comprehensive treatment. As they packed up the clinic, exhausted but exhilarated, Melissa approached James. "Dr. Carter, I have to show you something." She led him to a bulletin board in the community center, where dozens of sticky notes had been posted. Each contained a message of gratitude from the patients they had seen that day. "Thank you for caring about our neighborhood. First doctor visit in 10 years, you might have saved my life. My children finally got the checkups they needed." James read each note, his vision blurring with tears he didn't try to hide. This was why he had become a doctor all those years ago, to make a tangible difference in people's lives. Richard joined them, placing a hand on James' shoulder. "Not bad for a first day, eh, Doc?" James nodded, too moved to speak immediately. Finally, he said, "This is just the beginning, Richard, just the beginning." In the months that followed, the mobile clinic became a regular fixture in neighborhoods across the city. Word of its success spread, leading to additional funding from community organizations and eventually a grant that allowed them to expand to 2 mobile units. James still worked at the hospital, but as he had promised Alina, he reduced his regular hours to focus more on the mobile clinic project and spending time with his family. He found a balance that had eluded him for much of his career: meaningful work, combined with time for the people and activities he loved. Richard became a paid staff member of the mobile clinic program, his experience as both a patient and a community member proving invaluable. More importantly, he regained the sense of purpose he had lost after his injury. One evening, almost a year after that fateful midnight walk, James and Alina hosted a barbecue in their backyard. Their children and grandchildren were there, along with Richard and his daughter, Melissa, and several other colleagues who had become friends through their work on the mobile clinic. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the gathering, Richard raised his glass in a toast. "To Dr. James Carter," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "The man who not only saved my life but gave it new meaning." Glasses were raised all around as Richard continued. "A year ago, I was alone in an alley thinking my time was up. Now look at me, surrounded by friends, doing work that matters, watching my grandkids grow up." His voice broke slightly. "All because one man decided to take a different route home that night." James shook his head, moved but embarrassed by the attention. "It wasn't just me, Richard. It was Marcus who drove us to the hospital, Melissa and the emergency team who treated you, Alina who supported the clinic idea from the start. It was all of us together." "That's true," Richard acknowledged. "But it started with you, Doc, with your choice to stop and help a stranger in the middle of the night." Later, as the party wound down and guests began to leave, James found himself alone with Alina on their porch swing. The same swing where they had sat countless times over their decades together, sharing dreams, sorrows, and quiet moments like this one. "Penny for your thoughts," Alina said, leaning against his shoulder. James smiled, watching the last traces of sunset fade from the sky. "I was just thinking about how sometimes the most important journeys in our lives begin with a single step, or in my case, a flat tire." Alina laughed softly. "Some would call that coincidence, others might call it fate." "What do you call it?" Alina considered for a moment. "I call it being exactly where you were meant to be, exactly when you were meant to be there." James nodded, thinking back to that night, the flat tire, the dead phone, the decision to walk home. So many small choices that had led to a profound change, not just for Richard, but for himself and countless others touched by the mobile clinic. "You know," he said slowly, "I've been thinking about the future of the clinic. About expanding it further, maybe creating a model that other hospitals could adopt." Alina sighed dramatically. "And here I thought you were finally slowing down." "Not slowing down," James corrected, "just changing direction." As the stars appeared overhead, James reflected on the journey of the past year, from a doctor nearing the end of his career and feeling the weight of his years to a man with renewed purpose and vision. From a chance encounter in a dark alley to a community initiative that was changing lives daily. He thought of all the patients the mobile clinic had served, people who, like Richard, might otherwise have gone without care until it was too late. He thought of the young doctors like Melissa who had embraced the project, perhaps carrying it forward long after he stepped away. And he thought of Richard, whose life had been transformed not once but twice, first saved in that rainy alley, then given new meaning through his work with the clinic. It had all begun with a midnight walk, a doctor, a medical bag, and a choice to stop when others might have passed by. A simple act of compassion that had rippled outward, touching countless lives. "You know what, Alina?" James said softly. "I think the best is still ahead of us." Alina squeezed his hand in response. Above them, the stars continued their silent journey across the night sky, bearing witness to the quiet moments that sometimes change the world. One life, one choice, one midnight walk at a time. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.